Today's sermon on our seventh principle is my final step in following through on my intention to do a series of sermons on my interpretation of each of our seven principles in turn. Although I'm contemplating doing one more to sort of summarize it and tie it all together and put a nice little bow on it. As I've warned you many times before, my only real qualification to speak to you is that I think about stuff too much. I don't pretend to be an expert on the subjects I'm talking about. I'm just an amateur philosopher with a habit of trying to look at things objectively and from different, sometimes very different, points of view. I only hope to give you some things to ponder and to stimulate your own thinking. Once again, I'd like to start by going over our principles, which are listed in the front of your hymnal. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. I find these principles taken as a group to constitute a remarkably complete, self-consistent, and interlocking moral code. These principles were agreed upon by our association, not handed down as law by a prophet or a deity. Thus, they constitute a living tradition that we can add to or clarify or update as the need arises. As Unitarian Universalists, we don't have a creed, but we have our principles which are at the core of what it means to be a UU. And while there's plenty of room for interpretation of their meaning, at least according to our bylaws, a member of our congregation is expected to be in sympathy with these principles. The principles are not a belief system in themselves, but rather a framework around which to build our individual belief systems, or a touchstone against which to test our beliefs. That is, if we find that our beliefs are in conflict with the principles, we probably need to re-examine our belief system. The first six principles relate primarily to human society, interpersonal relations, and personal growth. The seventh principle is the only one that goes beyond that to recognize that we humans are part of something bigger. Accordingly, the seventh principle can be understood to cover environmental issues, conservation, and ecology. In that sense, it encourages us to work to promote actions and ways of life that preserve Earth's ecosystem, and to work against those that threaten it, both in our personal lives and on a societal level. But I'm going to assert that it's more than that. There are others, even within this congregation, much more qualified than myself to talk in detail about the natural world, conservation, climate change, sustainability, and related issues. And we might disagree on the details of what needs to be done and what the highest priorities are. So that's not what I'm planning to do today. Instead, I'm going to delve into the deeper meaning of the seventh principle, which is the basis for all that good work, and its relation to my personal spiritual beliefs. As I've done with the other principles, I'm going to start by parsing out the wording in detail. We'll start with respect for. Respect, in this context, I think, connotes recognition and appreciation. It's not a matter of faith. The interdependence is there. If you look deeply, you can't help but see it. So to me, respect here means a commitment to engage in that deep looking. If we begin to truly appreciate how interconnected the universe is, respect goes beyond just acknowledgement to awe, to a profound reverence for the intricate and beautiful complexity of reality. Now, because that interdependence is so complicated, I can only comprehend a small fraction of it, and I can only endeavor to convey a fraction of that fraction to you, but I hope I can give you some things to ponder and maybe even blow your minds a little along the way. Now, the interdependent web. As I've grown older and arguably wiser, I've developed a deeper and deeper appreciation for interdependence, for the visible and invisible tendrils that comprise the web linking everything to everything. This is a result of a combination of things: meditation practice, Buddhist teachings, observation, and objective study of how the universe works. I'm not sure whether it's been my affinity for Buddhist teachings that has led me to this appreciation, or this dawning appreciation that makes Buddhism resonate with me, or some of both. From a Buddhist viewpoint, or at least from my understanding of Buddhism, everything is connected. Nothing, including the self, has a separate, independent existence. Vietnamese Zen teacher Thich Nhat Hanh refers to this state of affairs as interbeing, and uses the example of a sheet of paper to illustrate it. As he explains, you can see a cloud in the paper because without a cloud, there is no rain. No rain, trees can't grow. Without trees, we can't make paper, and thus the cloud is necessary for the paper to exist. He goes on to say that if we look more deeply, we can see sunshine. We can see the logger who cut the tree, the wheat that made the bread the logger ate, the logger's parents, all necessary for this sheet of paper to exist. If you have the time, you could follow this chain all the way back to the Big Bang. Or, as Carl Sagan put it more succinctly, if you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first create the universe. Actually, invent the universe, I misquoted, sorry. Now we move on to of all existence. This is a reminder that interdependence applies to the entire universe, not just, say, the ecosystem of our planet. Even our local ecosystem has to be interpreted as including that huge fusion reactor we call the sun, and without which spaceship Earth would be a cold, dead rock. So even when considering life on Earth, we have to extend our radius of interdependence at least to include our solar system. Finally, the phrase, of which we are a part. It may sound like a bit of an afterthought, but the realization that we are an integral part of the interdependent web, not apart from it, not outside observers or alien invaders, is profound. And I think it's so important that I'm now going to talk about it at some length. I believe that we are born into an illusion of separateness that sadly is a natural inclination. It's a result of our survival instincts, without which we wouldn't be here. We really are individuals. We are each one consciousness, inextricably linked to one body, and we do indeed each have a unique perspective on reality. And we naturally tend to divide reality into me and not me, and that survival instinct leads us to assume, not always without justification, that a lot of what's not me is out to get me. So we can come to see life as a struggle of me against the universe. We can unconsciously fall into a flawed worldview in which we see ourselves as having been plopped into this reality from somewhere else, rather than as being a product of it. I feel that many religions play a role in deepening and perpetuating that view. There have been many cults, both old and new, that explicitly teach that this world is an evil, flawed place where our souls, or our real selves, have been somehow trapped. And we need to seek liberation from the prison of this reality. And it's not just cults, actually. Some mainstream religions, including Christianity, implicitly teach a sort of a kinder, gentler version of the same thing. That we're here, stuck here for a while, but you know, stick it out and we'll get to go somewhere better. Or worse, depending. This illusion of separateness applies not only to each of us individually, but by extension to humankind as a whole. At one extreme, it can lead to the view that the universe was created just for our benefit, that the earth was put here for us to conquer and exploit. At the other extreme, there's the notion that humankind is the only thing wrong with the universe, that if we hadn't come along like a marauding virus, the earth would be an idyllic paradise. What both these extremes have in common is the mistaken division of reality into humans and everything else. I had an epiphany recently, an insight that actually did come during a meditation session. that forever shattered that illusion of separateness for me. It was the rather sudden and deeply felt realization that I am a product of this reality that we call the universe, not a visitor from another realm. That I belong here, that this planet, this universe is my home. It was probably a feeling much like that of someone I recently heard talking about through hiking the Appalachian Trail, who related that he came to realize that he wasn't just passing through an ecosystem, he was part of it. My consciousness, what I call myself, is an inherent part of and a product of my physical existence. It may transcend my physical existence in the same way that the flame on that candle over there transcends it. The flame wouldn't be here without the candle, but it's not the candle. It's something more. And you can look at the flame wouldn't be there if somebody hadn't lit it and if there wasn't oxygen to support the fire, and that's a little lesson in interdependence all its own, but that's neither here nor there. While the flame may seem magical in a sense, it certainly did to our distant ancestors. Some being in the sky didn't send it down from on high, and likewise a deity didn't wave a wand and send my consciousness down from heaven when I was born, or conceived, or somewhere in between. Another way to put it is that consciousness may be a transcendent phenomenon, but it is an emergent one. Indeed, what I call myself is not some fixed entity. I change, hopefully I grow, all the time, primarily through my interactions with reality and with other people. It recently occurred to me that when we argue about nature versus nurture, that is, the relative roles of genetics and environment in determining human behavior, what we're missing is that genetic makeup is not a random thing. It was affected by a whole lot of other people's behavior and environmental influences before you ever came along. So the debate is perhaps really about environmental influences before you were born and environmental influences after you were born. The danger of not seeing that we are an integral part of the web is that the alternative is something like, this is not our home, we don't really belong here, we're just passing through. We are just as natural as any other species on the planet. In some sense, this smartphone is as natural as a beaver dam or a termite mound or a hornet's nest, if a little bit more complicated. The distinction between natural and artificial is a bit arbitrary. You thought I was going to say artificial. Speaking of smartphones, let's note that as complicated as this gadget is, it's nothing without cellular and Wi-Fi networks, a constellation of GPS satellites, software developers writing apps for it, and most of all, a vast network of people and organizations to communicate with, which gives some insight into just how impressive the interdependent web of human society is. But given that that's covered pretty well by our other 6 principles, I'll stop there and get back to talking about all existence. I'm calling this part of my talk Origins of the Interdependent Web, although I could just as well have called it some semi-random things that I thought were pretty cool. Admittedly, most of this is more about interconnectedness than interdependence, but the two are related. Let's start at the beginning, which of course would be the Big Bang. Something I want to mention here, I've heard the argument in various forms, an argument for the existence of God that goes something like this. We can look around and see that nothing just springs into being, that everything comes from something else. Everything is produced by another thing. The universe is a thing, therefore it was produced by something, which we will call God. And if you agree with that somewhat circular reasoning, then aha, you believe in God. And somehow that means that you have to admit that the claimant's particular concept of God is the correct one. Perhaps the universe is indeed the product of some transcendent reality, some larger framework within which it was created. I can't prove otherwise, but that certainly doesn't mean that it was created by a particular deity or even anything like a conscious entity. Defining God as whatever or whoever created the universe is generalizing the concept to the point where it really loses any meaning. So I'm not going to argue with anybody about why the Big Bang happened. I'm also not going to actually talk about the Big Bang because Peter did a very good job of that just a couple weeks ago. So I'm going to jump ahead just a bit. All of the heavy elements in the universe were formed through stellar processes, not counting the latest few that we've made in, laboratories. Fusion in dying stars, supernovas, colliding neutron stars. We really are literally made of stardust, so we already have that in common. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins and thus ultimately of life. I find it interesting that there are simple amino acids in interstellar space, and that carbonaceous meteorites, most notably the Murchison meteorite in 1969, containing amino acids and other organic compounds, have hit the Earth. This at least raises the possibility that life on Earth, and perhaps elsewhere, began by being seeded from space. Not by aliens, just by natural processes. I find the story of the evolution of the universe and of life, up to and including human life, far more amazing and awe-inspiring than the idea that humans were created one week by a cosmic magician waving a magic wand. I've always felt that way, even when I had a stronger belief in God, that I'd be more impressed by a deity who could create a universe governed by physical laws that would eventually result in intelligent life than one who could just poof a fully formed universe into being. I'd like to recommend a fascinating book called Thank God for Evolution by self-proclaimed UU evangelist, Reverend Michael Dowd, in which, according to the New York Times, Dowd presents evolution as a sacred epic of emerging complexity. Whether by cosmic accident or intentional design, I find it amazing that the entire observable universe seems to be governed by the same set of physical laws and the same forms of matter, and that those laws and those forms enable the formation of suns and planets and ultimately a chemistry of life. This is, of course, circular reasoning. If life were not possible, I wouldn't be here to marvel about it. But still, it's pretty awesome. Consider that the laws of chemistry allow carbon and a few other elements to combine in the primordial soup in ways that allow the formation of DNA. That this leads to single-celled organisms and, after eons of evolution and many twists and turns, ultimately to intelligent life. I'm in full agreement with Michael Dowd that the evolution story is a sacred epic, and I also agree with Thomas Paine's assertion in The Age of Reason that if there is a word of God, it's to be found not in some Bronze Age texts, but in the creation we behold. Consider, all life on Earth is DNA-based, coded in combinations of the same 4 bases, although the expression of said DNA obviously varies widely. It's been hypothesized that there might be other life chemistries possible, but carbon-based chemistry with water as a working fluid has so many advantages over other possibilities that it's pretty likely that any extraterrestrial life we might encounter will also be DNA-based, even if the coding is wildly different than anything on Earth. It'll be coded in the same language. When we look at DNA commonality, it becomes pretty obvious that all life on Earth shares common origins. I found some numbers from an article in Business Insider, of all places, which compiled these from various sources, but the numbers I'm going to quote all came from the National Human Genome Research Institute. Our DNA commonality with a random other human is 99.9%. With a chimpanzee, 96%. With a cat, 90%. A cow, 80%. And even a banana, 60%. Several other things I want to mention because they also relate to the interconnectedness of humans and with other life on the planet, and in so doing make it pretty obvious that human beings were not designed from scratch. In Thank God for Evolution, Dowd describes what he calls the quadroon brain, which has previously been referred to as a triune brain until he added to it, and makes it clear that the human brain evolved by adding new compartments while keeping the old. That is, we kept our reptilian brainstem and hindbrain, then a limbic system from early mammals, then a neocortex from higher mammals, particularly primates and dolphins, and finally our prefrontal cortex. A little further digging reveals that we're not the only species with a prefrontal cortex or something similar, and that what gives rise to the higher functions of human consciousness is not actually the addition of a new brain structure, but basically new wiring paths within the existing structures. But I am not a neuroscientist, so I will leave that at that. In the show Cosmos, a space-time odyssey, yeah, maybe an oddity, which was basically a remake of Carl Sagan's Odyssey series, or Cosmos series. Neil deGrasse Tyson described the evolution of the eye, starting from a simple ability for a single-celled organism to tell light from dark, all the way to fully evolved eyes in fish, where the evolution pretty much stopped. Our fluid-filled eyes evolved for underwater use. We still have them because evolutionarily they're good enough, but they're not as good as they would be if they were actually designed for land animals. I'm going to bring up fungi because it relates to interdependence in our biosphere in ways we don't often think about, and simply because the mushroom chapter of Michael Pollan's book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, is kind of fascinating. What we call mushrooms are actually the fruiting bodies of much larger organisms that live primarily underground. Fungi are not plants, they're a whole other kingdom of life. We don't fully understand them, but they play crucial roles in the ecosystem. There are two major types: saprophytic fungi, which decompose dead vegetable matter, and without which we'd be buried under the stuff, and mycorrhizal fungi, I had to look up the pronunciation, which exist in a symbiotic relationship with trees by wrapping around or penetrating their roots, and without which trees would have a much harder time. Closer to home, so to speak, there's more to us than us. That is, we are not just a highly organized collection of cells sharing a DNA blueprint. We are crawling in microbes, most of which are necessary to our survival. I found a very informative 2012 article from the National Institutes of Health on the NIH Human Microbiome Project, from which I learned that the human body contains 10 times as many microorganisms as human cells, although because of their smaller size, on average, we only have about 3 pounds worth of microbes in us. Just to be clear, these are living organisms that do not share our DNA. In fact, there are about 10,000 different species with 360 times more unique genes than in our own genome. But in large part, they are crucial to our survival. Most notably, without them, we could not digest food. They clearly co-evolved with us. So are they part of us or not? Or are we just inextricably linked to the interdependent web? Taken together, all these fun little snippets, well, except the mushroom one, support my epiphany. We weren't designed and created by a supernatural being waving a magic wand. We evolved from and are an inseparable part of that vast interdependent web we call the universe. So what role should we play in the web? I have a two-part answer. First, from the point of view of the universe as a whole, it's absolutely breathtakingly magical that 14 billion years or so after the universe sprang into being, things have arranged themselves so that some little piece of that universe should develop conscious life that transcends mere mechanistic processes and endeavors to understand and appreciate the very universe that brought it forth. In that sense, we are the eyes and ears, the consciousness of the universe. There's a line that's reused or paraphrased so frequently that I can't find the original author. We are the universe becoming aware of itself. Julian Huxley said something similar, as did Carl Sagan. My two favorite versions, though, are first this from Eckhart Tolle, and that's how he pronounces his name. You are not in the universe, you are the universe, an intrinsic part of it. Ultimately, you are not a person, but a focal point where the universe is becoming conscious of itself. The only problem I have with that quote is it depends on how you define person. I don't see why you can't be a person and a focal point. And second, this reading from our hymnal by Annie Diller. We are here to abet creation and to witness to it, to notice each other's beautiful face and complex nature, so that creation need not play to an empty house. The second and longer part of the answer is from the point of view of the planet we call home. First, if we can dispel the illusion of separateness and start to recognize that this is our home, perhaps we can start to view our role here as one of stewardship rather than one of dominion and exploitation. That is, our goal should not be to heroically conquer our environment or, same thing from another point of view, greedily exploit it, but to interact with it sustainably and take care of it as if it were the only planet we had. Things do change. Evolution continues, and especially in our rainforests, new species are born and die all the time. The current consensus seems to be, though, that human activity is resulting in far more extinctions than would otherwise occur. The purpose of environmental conservation and sustainability efforts can't be simply to maintain the status quo, but to keep from losing the essential diversity of our ecosystem. We must work toward a sustainable, less destructive future where our local piece of the interdependent web will collapse. We have to respect the effects of our actions on everything else. That's interdependence. It's also karma in the Buddhist sense, depending on which Buddhists you talk to, which is simply the observation that actions have consequences and those consequences cannot be avoided. The irony, of course, is that if we destroy the planet thinking that it's somehow a competition that we're trying to win, it's really ourselves that we're destroying. In one sense, life is very tenacious, but in another, especially higher up the complexity chain, it's also quite fragile. If we upset the balance so far as to destroy the ecosystem, it'll probably rebuild itself over the next few million years, but without us. The global warming and the consequences thereof, the resulting climate change, probably won't kill us all, but left unchecked, it will be extremely disruptive to life on this planet. And it could kill us all. Right now, the coral reefs are in big trouble. If we manage to kill off ocean life, we may get a harsh lesson in interdependence. I'm heavily bothered by the corporate and governmental interests that promote climate change skepticism while knowing full well that anthropogenic global warming is a real thing with deadly consequences, all in the name of short-term profit. Especially callous is the argument that climate is always changing, or that we've already passed the point of no return, with the implied corollary that that means it's no big deal if we speed it up a bit. To me, that's like trying to defend a murder by saying that the victim was going to die anyway. What's the big deal if it happened a bit early? I heard a news story the other day that really saddened me. There are at least 6 countries, including Russia, Canada, the United States, and several Scandinavian countries, who are rushing to stake their claims in the Arctic. Why? Because receding polar ice is making vast quantities of minerals and fossil fuels accessible that weren't before. Hey, if the world's going to die, might as well make a buck, right? We have to do better, because we as a species are capable of such an outsized effect on the ecosystem, and because, unlike other species, we are actually able to appreciate the long-term consequences of our actions. We have a responsibility to take care of the planet. Now, we're not necessarily that good at fully foreseeing the consequences. Often when we try to fix things, we end up making them worse. Kudzu comes to mind, which actually was introduced as an effective ground cover, which it turns out it is. An effective everything else cover, too. So ideally, we would be better off not breaking things in the first place than trying to fix them after the fact. But anyway, just to wrap this up, if there's such a thing as a typical 7th principle talk, this wasn't it. But what I mostly hoped to convey was, first, that the universe we inhabit is indeed a vast interconnected web, And all in all, a pretty incredible place with a pretty amazing history. Next, that we're born with an illusion that somehow we exist separately from the rest of the universe. We don't. We are each an integral part of the interdependent web, brought forth by that web, and this universe is our home. And more specifically, that we are an integral part of the Earth's ecosystem. We have a right to be here, but we need to appreciate that our actions can have far-reaching consequences on that ecosystem. Because we are conscious, ostensibly intelligent beings who can appreciate the consequences of our actions, we have a responsibility to minimize the harm we do and to take better care of the place. Thanks for listening.